Today we have the pleasure of welcoming Tina as a speaker. Tina has more than a decade of experience as a marine ecologist, like all over the planet, Caribbean, the Pacific, and Australia. She did her PhD at Newcastle University in the UK, then a postdoc at University of Science and Technology in Hong Kong, and joined the Marine Spatial Ecology Lab here at UQ in 2020, and has been here with us at UQ ever since. And today she's going to talk about Australia's experience in managing Crown-of-Thorns Starfish outbreaks in a changing climate. My education about Crown-of-Thorns Starfish is from Octonauts. So I'm really looking forward to this talk to learn what you can do other than bubbles. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Tina and hear more about her amazing work.
Thank you. I actually didn't know about the Octonauts episode, so I feel like I need to go and watch that and maybe weave it into my talks in the future to capture a large audience. Yes, that was a great intro. I'm not going to spend much more time on that. I do firstly. Oh, sorry. Okay, that's not working. Let's check. That's still not registering. Oh, there we go. Yeah. So firstly, I just want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the Great Barrier Reef and its catchments, and particularly the Turrbal and Jagera peoples of Canton, where we live and work and where we're meeting today. This was a modified talk from a citizen science conference in Taiwan, so I kind of used the opportunity to present to you at CBCS as well. But I think it's important to give a bit of background, talk about Crown-of-Thorns starfish outbreaks on the GBR, for those of you who aren't too familiar, talk about Australia's control program, and then how that's going to actually change with climate change. I'm sure I don't need to tell you how important the Great Barrier Reef is. Everyone is aware of that, especially living in Queensland. But just to put some of those things into context with a few statistics, the Great Barrier Reef holds 10% of the world's coral reefs. It is made up of over 3,000 individual reefs. As I'm sure we all know, it is enormous. It's about the size of Italy. It's over 2,400 kilometers long. It's home to millions of different types of plants and animals, including over 400 species of corals and over 1,600 species of fish. It's also an economic powerhouse. So Deloitte just came out with a report showing that it contributes $9 billion annually to the Australian economy, which is huge, and also provides about 64,000 jobs. Because of this, back in 1981, it was determined to be a UNESCO World Heritage Site, which obviously puts it as globally important on the world stage as well. So, Crown-of-Thorns starfish. Many of you may not have heard of these starfish before. They are native to the Great Barrier Reef and to the wider Indo-Pacific, but they're considered to be pests because they feed on live coral. So they are a natural part of the ecosystem, but every kind of 10 to 15 years, they reach outbreaking proportions where you can have hundreds of thousands of them stripping entire reefs of live coral cover. So what is the history of these outbreaks? Since we've been recording information on them, I suppose, since about the 1960s, we've had 4 major outbreaks. So this is just a plot from Cape York, which is one of the sectors on the Great Barrier Reef. Essentially, you've just got how many pots are seen on surveys, and then you've got the years going from 1986 to 2026. And as you can see, they have these kind of boom and bust dynamics where they kind of spread up into these outbreaking proportions. There are thousands of them everywhere, and then it kind of drops down and they disappear for a while. And as I mentioned, when they actually do have these outbreaks on these reefs, they can strip about 90% of the healthy coral tissue from the reef. So on the top photo there, you've got a reef, healthy reef before an outbreak, and then the photo on the bottom, you can see what happens after an outbreak. So they cause substantial damage. What actually causes an outbreak? Basically, we don't know. It's a combination of a few different biological and environmental factors that probably all work together to allow these outbreaks to happen. So firstly, they are highly, highly fecund. They can have hundreds of millions of eggs. So adults will spawn in the summer months and females will release all these millions of eggs, and they can just drift on the ocean currents and spread quite far. They've also got exceptional larval survival. So those larvae can actually survive for quite a long time in the water column, typically about 11 days, but they can actually drift for weeks and arrive at reefs hundreds of kilometers away from where they originally were spawned from. And so connectivity is a very, very big driver as well. This is kind of a basic map of the GBR, and you can see there's arrows there that just show the larval flow of Crown-of-Thorns starfish. And the thicker arrows and the darker arrows show very, very strong connections. So basically, what we typically see is that outbreaks start a little bit further north, and then they spread southward along the GBR. And all of those reefs are very, very highly connected, and so these larvae can just spread everywhere. And that means that you'll get larvae that can settle hundreds of kilometers from where they were originally spawned. On top of that, food availability is something that's quite important. So with increased runoff from agriculture, flooding, different types of land use, you get an increase in nutrients, then you get more phytoplankton, which are the microalgae at the bottom of the food chain. And that obviously provides food for those larvae as well, so that they have even more optimal conditions to survive for longer. On top of that, because humans have obviously impacted the food webs in many places through overfishing, they might not have very many predators, or the food chain and the food web has been altered based on our activities. So through the overfishing and removal of top predators, you then have potentially a trophic cascade, the release of those invertebrate predators that are no longer, that are then eating too many of the crabs or invertebrates that we now know are key predators of the juvenile life stages. So essentially, it's probably all of these things working together, and it's probably also context dependent for each specific reef as well. So what do? Obviously, reefs at the moment are going through a lot of stress. So Crown-of-Thorns starfish are supposed to be there, they're part of the ecosystem. But when you add in other problems like climate change, overfishing, pollution, etc., whereas reefs might normally have been able to rebound from a starfish outbreak, now they really are struggling to do so. And so in 2019, the Reef Authority established what's called the Crown-of-Thorns Starfish Control Program. This is a official targeted control program that follows the integrated pest management framework. So what that means is it's constantly integrating science and technology to be as effective as possible. Why is there an injector? So essentially there are teams of trained divers and snorkelers that are patrolling the GBR on dedicated vessels, and they patrol up and down the reef and they inject the starfish with vinegar. And this has been found to be a very effective and kind of natural mechanism of controlling these outbreaks and curbing those populations. So at the moment, on average, there are about 5 boats with teams of divers that go up and down the reef. And then there's a whole system which I'll talk to you about as to how they decide which reefs to go to. I'd just like to add that I did go on one of these boats when I first arrived here in Brisbane, and it is absolutely phenomenal. It is like a military operation. It is so amazing seeing how on a dive, you're kind of in a team of 10 people, you're using like military hand signals underwater, you've got your vinegar gun, you're trying to find starfish, you've got a stinger hood because it's stinger season, so it's like black ops. So it's very, very, very carefully programmed. And the goal is not to remove all the starfish, they're supposed to be there. It's just to curb their populations and bring them down to what's called the ecological threshold, where the amount of starfish in the system is at a low enough level that the coral cover or coral growth can actually outpace the number that are there. Early detection is really, really important. So there are a lot of targeted long-term surveys being done. So obviously transects, but also mantle toads are a really big thing for detecting crown-of-thorns starfish. Essentially what happens is an observer is towed behind a boat at quite a slow speed, but it means that you can cover a really large distance of the reef and actually identify starfish and get information on things like coral cover at the same time as well. New technology is also being implemented all the time, so things like robotics, trying to identify starfish using AI and machine learning. eDNA, so taking water samples to see whether there's DNA of these starfish in those water samples, and increasingly as well citizen science. So people actually going out on the reef, taking photos, uploading those to platforms, for example, Citizens of the Reef, and then you've got either volunteers or AI labeling those images to try and identify starfish as well. So where do we actually control? So at the moment, the Reef Authority has got a list of 500 reefs out of those about 3,806 that are called priority reefs. So those priority reefs were chosen because they are important ecologically, economically, touristically, culturally. They bring something that needs to be prioritized for starfish control. So every year then they have a target reef list, so they don't necessarily have the resources to go to all 500 reefs, so they decide which of those 500 reefs are we going to target this year, and then they also rank those. So there's an annual meeting where they get ranked as well and decide, okay, which of these is utmost priority, and then kind of second, third, so on and so forth. And so what happens when we actually get to the reef? So again, we've got about 5 boats. Each boat has got a kind of total pool of effort of about 3,840 hours. But not all of those hours of effort are going to actually culling or injecting. So we do have about 10% of the time they'll be surveying, so those mantle toads around the reef, or doing kind of reef health surveys and stuff like that. And then again, so the order list is target reefs, the remaining priority reefs, and then non-priority reefs. So when we get to a reef, what happens? So each reef is separated into these cull sites that are 10 hectares in size. That's 500 meters by 200 meters. And keep in mind that those divers are trying to control and close one site on each dive. So you're swimming 500 meters while also injecting starfish in currents, and it can be very, very tiring. So the people that do it are incredible. So what happens with a cull site? They basically get to a reef, they survey the whole perimeter, and if any of those sites has got starfish over a certain threshold, they send down a team of divers, and those divers will then hopefully control those starfish down to that ecological threshold. This is kind of so on and so forth. If there's still time remaining on that voyage, they'll go to another cull site. If it needs to be controlled, they'll control it, so on and so forth. They'll visit another reef until there's no more time or they've got to go back to port. So does control work? So this is the paper by Sam Matthews, who was a collaborator of ours at the Reef Authority. He basically analysed all of this control program data over many, many years. So prior to 2019, there was still control effort being done, but it just wasn't part of this kind of official targeted framework. And he basically looked at what the annual change in coral cover was for different groups of reefs. So he had looked at reefs that had no COTS outbreaks at all. He looked at reefs that had a really consistent and quite heavy control effort. He looked at reefs that had kind of minimal control effort, and then reefs that weren't controlled at all. And so what he found was, if you're looking at that dotted line being 0, obviously we want a kind of positive change in coral cover. We want to see that it's either maintained or it's growing, it's being saved. And whereas obviously on the left side of that dotted line, you're seeing that that coral cover is declining. And he found that when you have reefs that have consistent control effort, we do maintain or save coral cover. And so it does seem to work. But what we wanted to know was, how do we make it even more effective? And so this is kind of bringing in the work that we've been doing over several years here in the Marine Spatial Ecology Lab. So just again, to put it into context how big the reef is, I love using this with kids when I do my school outreach, just because we know that the reef is the size of Italy and we've all heard it, but what does it actually look like on the map? It's enormous. And we also know that the Reef Authority has got this really scientific and targeted way of choosing which reefs to go to. But we kind of wanted to know, can we actually make it more effective? It's hard to run all these kind of different scenarios and different decision-making strategies in the real world because of logistics, cost, etc. You can't just move boats to different places and see what happens. And this is where the strength of models comes in. So we use ecosystem models to run alternative control strategies that might benefit the reef more, to see what the outcome of that is. And then we can use that information to inform the reef managers, and they can then hopefully improve the control program over time. So what do we actually use? We have an ecosystem model that was developed through the research group over the past decade or more, called ReefMod. And essentially, every single one of those 3,806 reefs is represented in this model, and each reef is represented by a grid. And so onto that grid, we simulate individual coral colonies. Those coral colonies belong to these 6 groups, so kind of aquaporids, massive bacilloporids. And those corals are subjected to different ecological interactions, but they also go through a demographic process. So they start off with little larvae, they settle to the reef, they eventually become adults that will sexually reproduce and then spawn, and so on and so forth. But they can also die, they can turn into rubble, they compete for space with algae. There's lots of different things in it. So if you want to know more, read Eva Marie's paper, Bozek, because it's a huge piece of work that describes it all in detail. But we also obviously simulate these Crown-of-Thorns Starfish. So they, again, have the whole proper population demographic process. So they start off as larvae, they eventually become adults that reproduce and spawn themselves. And so what's important is that these reefs are all connected. So these starfish, these corals can spawn and self-recruit to their own reef, but they can also have larvae that is transported to reefs nearby through connectivity matrices that are based on hydrodynamic processes across the GPR. We also have a range of environmental interactions there as well. So we've got predicted heat waves, we've got predicted cyclones, we've got changes in water quality that all come from various other modelling teams. And then we also represent the cost control program as closely as possible as well. So we've got a realistic version of that in the model as well. And so firstly, we want to know what's the baseline scenario. So what actually happens in the model if we don't do any control at all? So we need to know what that is in order to know how control is actually going to improve things or not. So with each of these scenarios I'm going to talk about, we do run them multiple times in our model, and that's just to account for the fact that there's a lot of stochasticity in these processes. There's a lot of parameters with kind of large ranges that might change depending on how things go. So we run everything 20 times and we generally take the mean, and then we kind of look at the percentiles and how stuff changes. So firstly, if we start control in 2019, which is when it starts, and go all the way up to 2040, what happens in terms of coral area under a no control scenario on the Great Barrier Reef? It's not great. Obviously it declines over time. This is probably from a range of different things. You've got no Crown-of-Thorns Starfish control. We've got predicted increases in climate change up to 2040, so increasing heat stress, increasing cyclones, that kind of thing. When we look at the percent of reefs that are outbreaking, maybe a little bit kind of counterintuitive is that also goes down. So we are actually seeing declines in starfish under a no control scenario anyway, but that's just because the food availability is going down as well. So obviously the more coral that you lose, there's not going to be as much chance for these reefs, these starfish populations to stay at outbreaking proportions. So what we then wanted to do was to compare different scenarios, different control scenarios to what the control program is currently doing. So the current program basically patrols the entire GBR, so they go to all 4 of the management regions. But I'm not going to go into all these because we ran about 20 different scenarios. But essentially we looked at different things like what happens if you focus all your boats in the north or the south. We know as well that Crown-of-Thorns starfish outbreaks are more likely to happen on overfished reefs, and you're also likely to get more high densities of starfish on those overfished reefs, probably because of those altered food web dynamics. So what we also did was look at, should you actually send all your boats to those overfished reefs because there are more starfish, or is that a bit of a waste of effort and maybe you should focus on controlling the populations on healthier reefs and kind of spread your effort to more places. There's all these kind of trade-offs and decisions that managers actually have to think about, and we worked with them to actually understand what sorts of things they would actually do in a real-life scenario. We also looked at whether you should follow the outbreak front, so just keep moving to each reef nearby based on latitude to see where the outbreaks are. Whether you should actually just avoid some reefs. So if you get to a reef and you do a survey and there's millions of cots, is there any point in sending your control team down, or should you just cut your losses and move on and try and save reefs a little bit nearby? So those are the sorts of things that we were looking at. And so to actually understand what the impact of those was, we wanted to look at change. So here we are really looking at the difference between that control scenario and the no control scenario. So it's literally just one minus the other, the delta. So essentially we are looking here at predicted coral cover over time. This is just an example to help you understand, but we're kind of looking at what is the difference in either coral cover or coral area or the density of cots, those sorts of things, if we actually subtract one from the other. That's how we actually measure those benefits that we might see from control. So again, we compare all these scenarios, and then I'm just going to present some of the most promising ones here. So this is the change in coral area. How much coral area have we gained or saved from running these control scenarios? A lot of different ones, but importantly, if you focus on that dark purple, that's what the current control program is. And actually, that ended up being one of the most effective out of all the scenarios that we looked at, which obviously the managers were delighted to hear, because it means that the program that they're running at the moment is actually doing a very good job of saving coral on the reefs that they're going to. What was also interesting was that 2 of the other scenarios that performed really well were not bothering to expend that effort at those reefs where you're getting these really, really high densities of cots. And that's probably because you're able to then control more reefs by not wasting all your effort on a single reef that you kind of have to decide is maybe not going to make it. So essentially, yeah, current control program, we know from the control program data is highly effective, but also from modeling all these different scenarios, we do see that it's very, very effective for saving coral cover across the GBR. Another colleague of ours, who previously was at UQ, was also looking at just what happens if you increase effort. So at the moment, we have 5 boats across the GBR. So essentially, these different panels are how many boats you have on the GBR. And she just wanted to see, is there kind of a threshold at which you don't see returns from increasing that effort? And what was interesting was that no matter what happens if you keep increasing effort and increasing the number of boats, you are going to keep seeing returns on that investment. And so, yeah, obviously more boats, more coral, and we are starting to see that now. So we've got about 5 to 6 boats patrolling the GBR at the moment. But there are more and more kind of small operators that are going out and starting to get involved in these things. And that really suggests that all of that extra effort is going to be beneficial. I'm sure I don't need to tell you all, there have been a lot of very bad heat stress events on the reef over the past decade or so, and things seem to be getting worse. So these are maps just showing how severe bleaching has been across the GBR. 2016 was a particularly bad year globally, not just for the GBR. It's a big mass coral bleaching event. 2020 was also pretty bad. And then obviously last year was also one of the worst. So the recent AIMS reports have shown that coral loss on the GBR has been pretty substantial. This report came out this year, and they found that in the northern region, that coral cover has gone from about 40% to 30%, in the south from about 40% to 26%. So very devastating impact from that. And it's not just bleaching, we're starting to see more increasing number of severe storms as well. Maybe not ex-tropical storm, Cyclone Alfred or whatever it ended up being called, but Cyclone Jasper caused a lot of impact, and those sorts of things are becoming more and more frequent and more severe. But those storms also bring things like flooding, increased nutrient runoff, and all of those sorts of things. So what we wanted to know was what's actually going to happen to the benefits we see from Crown-of-Thorns starfish control with climate change. So do we actually still see those benefits even when we've got an increasing number of disturbances and other factors and stresses on the reef? This is a lot of graphs, but essentially it's the still baseline scenarios. So we're trying to understand, so what actually happens with no control under different climate futures. So this is that same ecosystem model. We're just looking at what happens with coral cover over time from 2019 when the control starts to 2040. So that's kind of the near-term environmental future, I suppose. We chose one single climate future in terms of the SSP. So we're assuming that warming is going to be under 2 degrees by 2100, which I realize is optimistic at this point. But when we were doing this analysis, it was kind of what we were aiming for. And also, because we're only really modeling up to 2040, this is near term, most of the SSPs are actually fairly similar up to 2040 anyway, so it doesn't change too much. It's only in the longer term that they really start deviating from each other. But the global climate models do actually change quite a lot. So we ran 3 different GCMs that have all got kind of different predictions. As you can see, in all of the coral cover declines, but we were kind of expecting that. But again, this is a scenario where we've not got any interventions, there's no control happening. It's kind of like worst case scenario with everyone sitting back and letting stuff happen. So then we wanted to know, okay, so what are the impacts of COTS control in each of those different futures? So again, just keep in mind that we're really just minusing the control scenario from the no control scenario in terms of coral cover. And then what we can do is, so we can focus on the reefs that are being controlled, and we can look at what threshold of coral cover is being achieved. So are we seeing benefits? Are we seeing positive changes in coral cover, which will be in the blue? Or are we seeing deficits or negative coral cover changes, which will be in the red? So obviously the darker the blue, the more positive, the greater gains that we're seeing, whereas the darker the red, the worse, more losses that we're seeing. And so this is an example just from this GCM. You can see that actually when the control program is implemented, we do see benefits accumulating over time. This is because not only are you able to get to more reefs because you're keeping those outbreaks under control, but you're also seeing benefits from those controlled reefs being spread to reefs nearby as well. I'm going to get into that in a second. You also see that there's about 85% of those predictions that are actually positive rather than negative. And there's about a third that are over 10% of a cover difference positively. So we are seeing quite large gains in coral cover from implementing that control, even as we get to the end of 2040, when we know where things are getting a little bit worse in terms of environmental stress. If you just look at it across all GCMs as well, obviously there are differences, but the patterns remain the same. So benefits accumulate over time. We are starting to see larger benefits as the control program ramps up. And essentially this suggests that we should really still keep doing what we're doing. Not all hope is lost just because we're seeing more environmental stress on the reef. So what about uncontrolled reefs? As I mentioned, it's not just controlled reefs where we see benefits, but potentially reefs next door because of connectivity. So we wanted to look at COTS and coral sink reefs. So sink reef is a reef that is going to receive larvae from a controlled reef. So a COTS sink would normally receive COTS larvae from that controlled reef, whereas a coral sink would normally receive coral larvae. So we looked at all of our controlled reefs in the model, and we only looked at their next door neighbours. So we didn't look at any of the reefs that were kind of, 2 steps further on. And we're really focusing on those reefs that are strong connections of those controlled reefs. And so again, we've got those 3 different climate models. Again, we're just looking at cover differences as thresholds of positives and negatives. And we've got 4 different groups. So the controlled, which obviously have got direct action, next door neighbour, COTS sink and coral sinks, and then completely uncontrolled reefs. So obviously blue good, red bad. Controlled reefs see the most blue, and they see the darkest blue as well, obviously, because those are the reefs where the control is actually happening. The cod sink reefs do see a lot of benefits as well, but actually it's the coral sink reefs that see even higher benefits or larger benefits than the cod sink reefs, which suggests that even though it is good to stop those crown-of-thorns starfish from spreading that larvae and causing more outbreaks, what's really important is saving that coral and making sure that that coral can actually spawn and those larvae can then spread to other reefs and kind of, I guess, contribute to longer term resilience of that coral community. And obviously, no controlled reefs, it's a bit hit and miss. You get some benefits, you get some losses. That's just because, yeah, obviously it's happening over time. Sometimes they'll do well from a not next door neighbor, but another reef being controlled, etc. It's a bit, yeah, all over the place. Anyway, we also wanted to know which factors were important in driving those losses and those gains. We pulled out tons of different variables, so things like the region, how frequently or recently there had been these disturbances or control, ecological variables like rubble, coral cover, etc. And we pulled all these out and ran mixed effects models to try and understand which of those were important predictors of either large gains or large losses. And what we found was that the disturbance regimes are really key. So here, you've basically got how much coral cover are we getting saved or maintained from crown-of-thorns starfish control, and along the y-axis you'd have years since disturbance. And kind of obviously, I guess, the longer recovery time that you have, the more benefits that you're going to see from that control program. So if you don't have a disturbance as frequently, you're going to actually be able to gain more from that control program. On the flip side, so again, this is how much coral cover you have, and then how frequently you have a disturbance. So this is severe bleaching or cyclones. The more frequently that you have disturbance, the less you're going to see benefits from that control program. And so frequent disturbances are really a key driver, and they were the strongest negative limiter in our models. So it was more important negatively to have frequent disturbances than to have more time to disturbance. The thing is that these models, although they're very good and we've got a lot of good predictions, what we haven't started to incorporate is how crown-of-thorns starfish behavioral biology might change with thermal stress. So we do obviously bring in the heat stress implications on corals, but there's a lot of work to suggest that crown-of-thorns starfish at different life stages are going to be changing their biology or changing their behavior. So as an example, we know that adults and sub-adults are actually quite resilient to short-term heat waves, but they do experience metabolic stress past a certain threshold. Larvae can continue to settle, but success will decrease and abnormalities will increase. Reproduction continues, but there might be early spawning, which could have consequences. And interestingly, juveniles seem to be fine. So juveniles can either be herbivorous, they start off just eating algae, and then at a certain point, they switch to becoming coral eating. And both the algal eating and the coral eating larvae, juveniles, don't seem to have any problems with heat stress, at least based on the work that has been done so far. And it's worth mentioning that a lot of this is lab and experimental work. There's not a lot of in situ observations or understanding of how that happens on the reef. There are also some behavioral responses. So there's a hypothesis called the juvenile and waiting hypothesis, which basically says those juveniles are starting out as only eating algae. They can actually stay only eating algae and stay in the system and wait until the environment is much more favorable for them to switch to becoming coral eating. So if there is thermal stress and there's a lot of bleaching happening and their food source coral goes down, they can just bide their time and hang out and wait until they decide that it's better for them to actually switch to eating coral. And then for adults, there's been a lot of observations from researchers out on the reef suggesting that these crown-of-thorns starfish might actually go to ground. So essentially, the more thermal stress, the worse the environment. They kind of disappear, but we really don't know where they go. So either they go into the reef matrix and just try not to move too much to reduce their metabolic stress, or maybe they go all the way down the reef into cooler waters to avoid thermal stress. Maybe they die. We've basically got no idea. And what we wanted to know is what this means for cost control. This currently is not being brought into the control program. And so this is work being led by a research assistant in our lab, Kailash Cook. So what he did was he analysed all of the control program data over the past however many years, and he started to link crown-of-thorns starfish observations and also culling numbers to heat stress. So here we're using a metric called DHW, which is basically the degree heating weights or how much accumulated heat stress there is on corals. So what he found, so here you've got crown-of-thorns starfish being observed on those mantitos, and then you've got DHW along the bottom. So as heat stress increases, you are seeing less and less crown-of-thorns on those manto surveys. Then he looked at how many cots are actually being culled on those dives. So here again, you've got the number of crown-of-thorn starfish being culled, so actually injected. Then you've got the heat stress along the bottom, and the different colours are just the different sizes of the crown-of-thorns that are being culled. And again, with increasing heat stress, you actually see a decrease in the number of crown-of-thorn starfish that are being culled as well. So what this suggests is that even though the control program is continuing as normal, they're actually not seeing as many starfish, and they're not culling as many starfish either. He then ran some complicated models to look at what the predicted catch per unit effort of these starfish would be over time through the year. So this is just how many starfish they predict to cull over the effort that they put in. And then you've got the year just going from October to October. And then again, that kind of heat stress is going to be different shades. So during those summer months, you can see that no matter the heat stress based on those different colors, you are getting a massive decrease in the predicted CPUE of those starfish. And the rate of decline depends on how much heat stress there is. So if it's not too warm, or if it's kind of low DHW, the dip in the predicted CPUE is far less than it is when you've got really, really hot temperatures and very high accumulated heat stress. And you can see then that there is a recovery in the autumn, but the rate of recovery also depends on how much heat stress there is. This is really interesting because it suggests that there are really strong seasonal and temperature patterns in the predicted CPUE. So even at low DHW, we do still see a bit of a dip in those summer months, but we obviously see a huge dip and a huge change based on that really, really high DHW. And that has got implications for the control program because obviously things are changing on the reef that we're not super aware of. So what he did was he then brought those changes into the ecosystem model that we have into ReefMod and started to see what the implications of those changes would be for the control program. So here again, we've just got coral cover over time. So how much coral has been gained in hectares over time. Again, predictions from 2019 to 2040. And so the light blue is just the standard control program, the way that we model it currently. And then the dark blue is what happens if you incorporate that decreased detectability and decreased culling efficiency as well. And the reason why that's important is because when you actually summarize all of those outputs, that's 2,000 hectares of coral that is not saved. So obviously the control program is less effective in those summer months, which potentially means that we should be changing the decisions that we're making on the reef. So what next? We obviously need very detailed cost surveys. So we need better understanding of where these animals are pre-bleaching, during bleaching, post-bleaching, and just in general. Again, outbreaks spread so easily, early detection is key. We need a better understanding of COTS biology. So obviously it changes based on different life stages. But really understanding how their biology and behavior changes is going to be key for improving the control program. And adaptive management is also very important. So potentially in those summer months, maybe it's actually not worthwhile culling as frequently. Maybe more effort should be going into surveillance. Maybe reefs that are being subjected to less thermal stress should be focused on. There's all these sorts of things that need to be understood. And we're working with the Reef Authority at the moment to develop more scenarios to understand in ReefMod. And also linking Crown-of-Thorns starfish management to wider coral resilience. So I didn't touch on restoration or any other interventions, but there's lots of work being done across the GBR to preserve coral communities that can be integrated with this. And I'll quickly go through the key takeaways, but basically the control program is highly effective, and out of all the strategies that we modeled, the current program is one of the best ones, which was good news. You do see benefits to other reefs, so it's not just controlled reefs, but reefs nearby, which really suggests that through connectivity we can achieve even more. Obviously, increasing the number of vessels could be good as well. I think that's something that the Reef Authority is currently looking into. Understanding that COTS behaviour under heat stress is going to be key for improving control and determining whether maybe there are bleaching specific triggers that change how the control program is being run. And COTS are manageable, so this is really a tangible thing that we can do to improve coral cover on the reefs that we're visiting. Climate change obviously needs to be addressed, but that's going to take uniformed decision making by a lot of countries globally, whereas we know that we can go out on the reef and see these benefits from this control program. And climate change is not the end of the world. It suggests that we really need to be adapting. We need to be thinking about what we're doing, potentially changing the decisions that we're making, rather than just continuing down the same scenario. This work was all done through the COTS Control Innovation Programme. which is a huge initiative with many different institutions, people doing lots of amazing research in many different areas of Crown-of-Thorns starfish behaviour, biology, control, etc. And the work that I specifically talked about is all part of the Marine Spatial Ecology Lab, and there were some collaborators whose work I presented, including me. So thank you all for listening. If you want to learn more about CSIP, visit the link, and happy to take any questions if there are any.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tina. That was incredible. So well presented, like really easy to follow. It's always it's great when talks are like that, when you have no clue about it, but you hang on. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Are there any questions?
Yeah, online. In fact, a series of questions. I'm from Rio.
Oh, cool.
Thanks so much to Tina. That was great. Do cots have a preference for eating specific coral morphology groups or species? How long does a single model run take? Within the model, which variables influence COTS outbreaks? And how do trigger variables impact life stages, outbreak size, starfish abundance?
So thank you, Rio, and also hi. The cots do have a preferred type of prey, yes, so they eat acroporids and bacilloporids, so those weedy kind of like branching corals, but there's been a lot of work to suggest that even though they prefer those, they will eat anything. So they'll start off feeding preferentially on those, and then they will continue to eat whatever's left. So there are implications, which I didn't really touch on, for just changes in coral community composition and biodiversity in general with these outbreaks. What was the second question? Oh, how long does the model run take?
Yeah.
So I run everything on the HPC, the high performance computers. A single run on my computer of 20. So the model actually starts in 2008, and there's a hindcast which sets everything up for the predictions into the future. So if I were to run a single run from 2008 up to 2040, it would take multiple hours. And then we obviously do 20 runs, so everything just goes to the HPC, and I don't look at it until it's done. But still a few hours at least. Sorry, what was the other one?
Within the model,
Yeah.
which variables influence COTS outbreaks, and how do trigger variables impact life stages, outbreak size, and starfish abundance?
Yes, that's a really good question. So COTS are generally, as I mentioned, so the disturbance regimes were really key in also looking at drivers of COTS outbreaks, because it's all linked to coral cover as well. So obviously if their food is there, then they can reach outbreaking proportions. If coral cover declines for whatever reason, then they are also going to decline as well. And so it's kind of a coupled like feedback loop in a way. Obviously where control is happening or not has a huge implication as well. And also, as I mentioned, the proportion of prey. So if there's more acroporids and bacilloporids, that can also have an influence, because their feeding rates will change based on which coral groups are in there as well. For the different life stages, so we don't actually have, so we have incorporated changes in Crown-of-Thorns starfish mortality based on reef protection status. So we have that in green zones where you've basically got a really healthy reef population, supposedly. COTS mortality is lower because we assume that the food web is kind of keeping them a little bit more under control. Whereas on blue reefs that are overfished, we actually allow COTS to have a lower mortality and reach greater numbers. What we're trying to bring into the model now is fishing pressure. There's been a lot of work by some of our colleagues in the lab as well that have shown that one of the biggest factors, I guess, driving down COTS populations is that juvenile mortality and mortality by these things like crabs and invertebrates at that smaller life stage. Although we do have size-specific mortality rates in our model, we don't currently think about how increased rubble could, well, we do think about it, we haven't parameterized how increased rubble might influence those invertebrate populations, which might influence Crown-of-Thorns. So basically, there's a lot of things that are being done on the reef in situ, a lot of amazing research, but it takes a bit of time for us to then understand how best to incorporate that into the model when we just don't have the data, basically. Yeah, thank you.
Is this a new phenomenon? The chart of when the previous outbreaks went back to late 90s or something like that. Is there any historical evidence of COTS outbreaks?
I think basically they only started being recognized in the 1960s, and before that, we don't really know. The data just isn't there. So from the 1960s, there have been 4 major outbreaks across the GBR. during that time, there have also been outbreaks in the Indo-Pacific, like in Taiwan, the Maldives sometimes has a problem, like Indonesia, Philippines. But those outbreaks tend to just be one-off. And it's, as well with the talk that I attended in your lab the other day, it kind of suggests that maybe there's an overfishing problem and then maybe these outbreaks can happen as a one-off thing. On the Great Barrier Reef, potentially due to the connectivity and having so many reefs nearby and just, I guess, such good larval spread that they're able to just keep coming back every 10 to 15 years. But before that, we just don't know, basically. I personally think it's a combination of all those things. Like, we've overfished, we've put so many nutrients in the water, we've altered so many different things that they're just able to rebound because they're probably not being limited at that juvenile stage. And so they're able to just rapidly get to that coral reading stage. And so we went to the Australian Institute of Marine Science a few years ago. They've been growing Crown-of-Thorns starfish from larvae. So the other thing is it's very difficult to age Crown-of-Thorns starfish. We actually don't know how big they are really. How old they are, which size. And they've been growing these larvae. So they knew that in this tank, every single starfish was exactly 2 years old. And some of them are like this big and some of them are like this big. So they're just these phenomenal creatures that can harness, they can do whatever, they can make the most of whatever environmental situation I think they're in. And if the environment is not favorable, they keep themselves small and they eat algae, and then suddenly coral starts to come back and they're like, oh, great, here we go. And then just take off again. Yeah.
Thanks, I really enjoyed that.
Thank you.
I have a kind of modeling question. On a lot of the graphs that show, say, coral recovery under leaves, it went great, and then it was a dip around 25.
Yeah.
And then it started recovering again. Is that some measure of price, like the dynamics being?
I think it's probably based on the predicted heat stress trajectories, is that just through the global climate models that they've got these kind of dips and changes in heat stress. But I don't know enough about that data to tell you for sure. I would need to dig into it. That's right. Is that right? Yeah. Yeah. So you've just got these kind of, I guess, cyclical dips in heat stress cyclones, etc. It might have just been that there's a big, for example, the way that we're seeing these bleaching events happening every kind of 4 or 5 years is probably the same into the future, that they're not necessarily all going to be as enormous every year. We are going to see bleaching in part of the reef, but maybe that was a big mass bleaching event predicted for 2035 as an example.
Yeah, it's pretty consistent across lots.
Yeah, but it's interesting because one of our colleagues, Igor Bozek, has been, so there's not just 3 global climate models, there's loads of them. And he's basically been running kind of all 10 that we have in the model. And there's so much change between them. So I kind of chose optimistic, moderate, and pessimistic. He's been running all 10, and yeah, there's a lot of difference between them all. And then obviously he's also been taking into account the different SSPs. So again, 2.6 was optimistic, and I don't think we're going to make it anymore, which is depressing. But kind of 4.5 and whatever the other one is 8 point so and so. Yeah, you've got very big differences in what's predicted. Yeah.
And a question related to the question historical, because I was I found myself thinking the same thing, not knowing anything. And sort of wondering, about the devil's advocate point of view of why this is in control. Single ecosystem process. To that point, have you, in the larger suite of models, have you looked at any where you tried to essentially partial out all anthropogenic coastal climate change fishing pollution? Do you still see, it's like I see there are 2 sides to the question. Do you still see projected declines if you were to model just sort of a completely natural, or kind of pressure-free ecosystem? And or are you able, if you hindcast the model, does it project kind of increasing coral cover going way back in time? Because that would seem, if that were the case, it would suggest that there's something going on that the model's not actually capturing ecosystem properly, or otherwise there's some sort of switch in the 60s.
So for the first question, so we started the model in 2008, that's where hindcast begins, and it has been validated against not only the long-term monitoring data for coral cover across the GBR, but we've also validated it against Crown-of-Thorns starfish predictions. So we know that we're well, hindcast is making a very good prediction of what's happened since 2008. We haven't gone beyond that. I don't even know if don't know how easy that would be because there's just a lack of data to really confirm those sorts of things. And then going into the future, we haven't done that to try and disentangle those drivers. I don't even know where I would start to try, because we still don't really understand how all of those pressures are influencing outbreaks dynamics. So when we're modeling these outbreaks, we're really almost modeling the second stage of the outbreak. We don't really still understand how they initialize or like what leads them to actually kind of bubble up at that reef. So trying to understand how those different pressures lead to differences in outbreaks would be very challenging. But if someone else has done something similar, I'd be happy to talk to them about it. But I think there's so much fundamentally that we're trying to understand about the way that these outbreaks occur, that we just don't have the information really at this point. I think we're getting there.
Another question online, this one's from Matt Holden. Thanks for that wonderful talk, Tina.
Yes.
It was interesting to see the trade-offs between targeting reefs with lots of cod but are overfished, so possibly less hope for ecosystem recovery, versus ones with less cods, but you have a better chance of doing something meaningful in them at a local scale.
Yeah.
Do you think the answers you came up with here might generalise to other invasive species with satellite and core populations of the pest? Or are your results really specific to this type of dispersal network?
Yeah, thank you, Matt. That was a good point. So yeah, we did see that. So focusing on those unprotected reefs actually led to really good benefits because I guess, the reefs that are protected are almost keeping the starfish under control themselves. So what's interesting is that some of the people that work on this control program came from a non-marine background and a kind of integrated pest management approach. So it's almost like some of the learnings from terrestrial has been applied to this marine setting. Obviously, what does make this so challenging is the connectivity and the flow of water and the flow of larvae. So I do think there are probably learnings for marine invasive species. And I'm not sure actually where we're at with the communication between those different groups of people. I think Australia has managed to establish this really amazing, effective program. I know that there are other countries that are trying to learn from that in terms of COTS. So this, again, I was speaking at a Taiwanese citizen science conference where they're trying to use some of these learnings to do COTS research and control on their reefs. I'm not sure for other species, it would be so species dependent, I think, as to what their biology is and how they're actually able to spread. So yeah, I'm not sure. That's a good point though.
How long have they been running the culling program?
So the official framework began in 2019 as like a concerted effort, but previous to that, there was a lot of control effort being run by the Reef Authority. It just wasn't kind of in this official integrated pest management framework. So that's probably been since 2011, 2009, something like that. But it was very much kind of just send boats out to certain reefs where they knew where there were these outbreaks. It wasn't this whole, now there's a whole decision-making framework where it's very structured, it's very official, and everyone follows these exact steps. So the operators will get to a reef, they've got a decision tree, they'll kind of do their survey and be like, right, where do we sit? Okay, what's the next decision? Where do we move from here? All the data gets input into these online dashboards and platforms that get shared with everyone. You can actually, if you go on the Reef Authority website, you can look at these dashboards and see which reefs are currently open, which are closed, how like frequently has control been happening. It's very,
So the last two outbreaks were in 2023 and like 2008 or 9.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. So they were running during both of those periods.
So the first one I wouldn't say officially, the control program officially was not really running, but they were trying to put out the fires as they were starting. Definitely this one, yes. And they have, so that paper I spoke about, Sam Matthews' paper, he actually looks at all the data from that outbreak period, and he shows that reefs where they had this concerted effort, they managed to reduce those outbreaks. So it is effective on those reefs. And because they had such timely action for that outbreak period, they managed to basically stop the spread way quicker than the time before where they didn't have that control program running. So sound like I'm like pariah for the, sorry, I don't work for the control program, but I do feel like it gets a lot of slack because obviously they're native, they are pests, and people are like, why are we spending all this time and money? But what we can see is that these reefs need all the help they can get. And if we can save a little bit of coral on these reefs and save that diversity, and they can seed reefs nearby, I don't see why that's a bad thing.
So I think the devil's advocate question, I'm not gonna, there is no answer to it yet. Is that, which comes back to one of the previous questions, is that, you know, these starfish do have passive boom bust dynamics if left alone.
Mm.
What's happening now, arguably, and one of the hypotheses is that they no longer have boom bust dynamics, they're now a perpetual persistent pest. And that could be because we're not allowing them to bust in these sites, we're taking the population down to that level. And that therefore they can continue. And so in fact, although the culling program is indeed giving us better state, in a world of persistent costs, it gives you benefits. The other counterfactual is you just turn it off entirely and allow the boom bust dynamics to continue.
Yeah.
And which effectively is in the model by switching off control. So,
Yeah.
but you know, that's an interesting question, and the authority are aware of it. They raise it often, but it just make you wonder.
Yeah. Don't think we
We don't have an answer.
don't have an answer basically.
I was, I guess, exactly, what is the pitch to a devil's advocate in terms of liking, so, because like a specific question that occurs to me is, what if you were to just hands off, let them boom and bust? Is it not possible that you get a huge reduction in coral cover and then sort of coral recolonization dynamics that would allow for accelerated natural selection of the next generation of coral to increasing water temperature and whatever the kind of contemporary environmental conditions are, because you're allowing this to sort of open up space that gets recolonized?
Yeah, possibly, and as Pete said, we don't know, and I think, you know, if we had the luxury of more time in the world and less climate change, then potentially that would be something, a bit of a natural experiment where we could just let that happen and see what the outcome was. But then you've got to sacrifice all of those reefs and just cross your fingers that they're going to come back afterwards, which, yeah, you know, it's possible, we just don't know, basically. Oh, sorry. Yes.
And the quality is to
So they chose, so originally they were using stomach bile from cows, I believe. Because they were testing lots of different substances to see what would work. And then they realized that vinegar was doing the same thing, and it's a lot cheaper and easier to get, especially for people potentially in different countries as well. Like, as I mentioned, in the Maldives, they do a lot of this, so they could just go get household vinegar and inject them. And sorry, what was your other question? Oh, that was it.
yeah.
Okay, cool. Thank you very much.
Any other questions? No, then let's.
Thank you.